The Ludwig von Mises Institute presents The Libertarian Tradition, an audio series with Jeff Riggenbach.
The land where the town of New Bedford, Massachusetts now stands, on Buzzards Bay on the South Massachusetts coast. Quick geography lesson for those who don't know the area well. If you head southeast across Buzzards Bay from New Bedford, what you reach on the other side of the bay is the Elizabeth Islands. If you keep going southeast, you cross Vineyard Sound and wind up on Martha's Vineyard. Okay, are we all oriented now? As I was saying then, the land where the town of New Bedford, Massachusetts now stands was purchased from the chief of the local Wampanoag Indian tribe by settlers from Plymouth Colony in 1652. 200 years later, in the early 1850s, New Bedford was a prosperous metropolis of around 25,000 people, whose local boosters like to call it the whaling capital of the world. It undeniably was, as Wikipedia puts it, one of the most important whaling ports in the world. The opening scenes of Herman Melville's Moby Dick take place in New Bedford. They were written there, in fact. David DeLeon, the well-known intellectual historian who teaches at Washington, D.C.'s Howard University, reports in his book, The American as Anarchist, Reflections on Indigenous Radicalism, that in 1857 New Bedford could boast half the entire American whaling fleet of 655 ships. According to DeLeon, by 1860, New Bedford was perhaps the wealthiest city per capita in New England, and was one of the most socially and intellectually well-endowed towns of the entire region. New Bedford, DeLeon writes, was a complex city of the world. Its wealth and diversity produced everything from polyglot boarding houses and brothels to some of the highest forms of rationalist religion. What were known then as advanced ideas were popular in New Bedford as well. The town served as a terminus of the Underground Railroad. An escaped slave named Friedrich Bailey arrived there via the Underground Railroad in 1838 and stayed on for 3 years. During that time, he changed his name to Frederick Douglass and became an abolitionist writer, editor, and lecturer. 10 years after his departure, New Bedford was still a hotbed of abolitionist sentiment. Douglass returned there frequently to lecture. Other prominent abolitionists of the day, William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips, for example, lectured there regularly as well. Living in and around New Bedford in those pre-Civil War years was a whaling outfitter, later a wholesale and retail grocer, named Abner Tucker. William O. Reichert claims in his book Partisans of Freedom, A Study in American Anarchism, that Tucker had something of a local reputation as a rebel because he had been shown the door by the Quakers for marrying outside the faith, although in his politics he was only a Jeffersonian Democrat, a stance that would be regarded as pretty radical in our day and age, but seemed far less so to Americans in the 1850s. A local newspaper, the New Bedford Signal, praised Abner Tucker, according to Reichert, as a liberal-minded man in religion as well as politics, and a notable reasoner upon the issues of the time. Reichert contends that Tucker's wife Caroline Cummings was a radical in her own right. David DeLeon agrees. Caroline Cummings, according to DeLeon, had been raised by a pronounced admirer of the individualism of Thomas Paine, who had encouraged his daughter to achieve an intensive education. Later, in her home, she welcomed radical guests, the literature of social change, and the ideas of the new science expressed by Darwin, Spencer, Buckle, Huxley, and Tyndall. When Abner and Caroline's son, Benjamin R. Tucker, was born into this comfortable, book-laden environment in April of 1854, he seemed, as William O. Reichert puts it, to have been destined for a life of nonconformity and dissent from the very start. And that's just the way things worked out in practice. By the time he was 18, as Tucker himself put it, I had been an atheist, a materialist, an evolutionist, a free trader, a champion of the legal 8-hour day, a woman suffragist, an enemy of marriage, and a believer in sexual freedom. By the time he was 18, though, Benjamin Tucker had left New Bedford behind him. An intellectually precocious student, he had graduated from high school at 16. Family tradition dictated that his next step be a move up to Cambridge, where he would enroll in Harvard. But young Tucker balked at that. Harvard's curriculum was the traditional college curriculum of that era, based on the classics, studied in the original Latin and Greek. Benjamin Tucker felt he had already had more than enough of this at his prep school, the New Bedford Friends Academy. He wanted to focus on modern ideas, modern issues, modern times, and his long familiarity with the ideas of men like Darwin and Huxley had convinced him that a scientific curriculum would be more worth his while. Finally, as David de Leon notes, at this time compulsory attendance at prayers was still enforced at Harvard. The 16-year-old Benjamin R. Tucker decided to enroll instead in an engineering program at a much newer school, a school first established only 9 years before, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, at its original campus in Back Bay, Boston. MIT didn't move across the Charles River to Cambridge until 1916. Tucker spent 3 years at MIT, but, according to de Leon, he really devoted himself to study of the MIT curriculum only when his time was not taken by plays, readings, concerts, reform lectures, and other activities that he regarded as more important. Just how much he learned at MIT is therefore uncertain. In the early 1890s, when he was in his mid-30s, he spent a couple of years editing an engineering magazine, so he must have picked up a thing or two during those 3 years. But he left without a degree in 1873 at the age of 19. The American journalist and editor Burton Rasco used to say that he left the University of Chicago in 1913 without a degree because he found that going to school was interfering with his education. Much the same seems to have been true of Benjamin R. Tucker with respect to MIT. Those plays, readings, concerts, and reform lectures to which de Leon refers were introducing him to books, works, and ideas that he found fascinating, but which were not included in his classes at MIT. As a 16-year-old freshman, for example, he had become aware of the notorious crusader for free love and women's rights, Victoria Woodhull, who had been the first woman ever to testify before Congress on the issue of women's suffrage. She had also been the first woman, along with her sister, Tenny Claflin, to operate a brokerage firm on Wall Street. The two sisters had used their profits from investments to launch a newspaper, Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, that polemicized on behalf of free love and women's rights, including, of course, women's suffrage, as well as such related causes as sex education, short skirts, licensed prostitution, and birth control, and a few unrelated causes, like spiritualism and vegetarianism. Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly was published from 1870 to 1876. At its peak, it had around 20,000 subscribers, one of whom was the teenage MIT student Benjamin R. Tucker. In 1872, the year Benjamin Tucker turned 18, Woodhull became the first woman ever to run for President of the United States. She ran on the Equal Rights Party ticket. Her vice presidential running mate was the former slave-turned-abolitionist who had spent some time in New Bedford, Massachusetts, Frederick Douglass. When Tucker learned that Woodhull was being denied required permits by town and city governments all over Massachusetts so that she couldn't bring her lectures, her chief means of attracting attention to her candidacy, to the people of those towns and cities, he sprang into action. He personally contacted the mayors of various Massachusetts communities and actually succeeded in browbeating at least one of them into issuing the needed permits, thereby paving the way for Woodhull's appearance. In gratitude, the 34-year-old Woodhull took the 18-year-old Tucker to bed. She also hired him as her tour manager. Then, after the campaign was over, as William O. Reichert tells the tale, Tucker joined the melange of lovers and social reformers who hung out at the Woodhull establishment in New York, accompanying that colorful troupe to Europe in the summer of 1874, paying for his own passage from funds given him by his parents for the furtherance of his education. Victoria Woodhull was far from the only important teacher Tucker met off campus in the early 1870s. He himself wrote late in his life that the innumerable lectures to which I listened in the years 1870 and 1871 were very interesting and stimulating, and made me familiar with many notable figures, some of which I recognized afterwards in my daily walks. Indeed, I might almost say that the day was an exception when I did not pass in the street either Ralph Waldo Emerson, or Wendell Phillips, or Oliver Wendell Holmes, or Charles Sumner, or A. Bronson Alcott, Alcott's daughter, Louisa, the author of Little Women, or Julia Ward Howe, or Lucy Stone, or the poet Longfellow, or Henry James the Elder, or Colonel T.W. Higginson, or President Eliot of Harvard. And then there were the individualist anarchists, Ezra Heywood, Josiah Warren, and Lysander Spooner, all of whom Tucker met at local reform lectures in and around Boston. He had met another of their number, Stephen Pearl Andrews, who was part of Victoria Woodhull's New York entourage, so their ideas were not entirely novel to him. But what these men taught him really blew him away, nevertheless, changing his entire way of thinking about society and politics and giving him a new primary focus for his intellectual activities that lasted for the rest of his life. He didn't give up all his other isms and causes, some of them, yes, but not all. In fact, he managed to hang on to most of them. He remained an atheist, a materialist, an evolutionist, a free trader, a woman suffragist, an enemy of marriage, and a believer in sexual freedom. But he did give up his advocacy of the legal 8-hour day, as well as the enthusiasm he had once felt for the movement to promote temperance by stamping out saloons and intoxicating spirits. He gave up his allegiance to any cause that called for, in his words, the subjection of any non-invasive individual to a will not his own. What Benjamin R. Tucker really wanted to do with himself, he now began to realize, was to devote himself entirely to individual liberty, and spend all his time writing and editing and publishing books and pamphlets, pushing these ideas he had learned from the individualist anarchists. But the time had come when he had to earn a living. He had come into a little money from the death of a family member, and Ezra Heywood had given him work on his radical paper, The Word, doing everything from writing and editing to running the printing press. But it was increasingly clear that he needed a full-time job. He was, after all, getting on in years. In April of 1878, he was 24 years old. As it happened, the experience he'd got on The Word got him in the door at the Boston Globe, where he spent the next 11 years, first as a printer, then as a proofreader, editor, and editorial writer. In the early 1890s, he moved to New York, where he held editorial positions on at least 2 different magazines. And all the while, from 1881 on, in his spare time, he was writing, editing, and publishing a fortnightly paper called Liberty. He published it for more than 25 years, all told, and in that time built it into one of the largest circulation and most influential and respected anarchist publications in the world. He also published many books, including his own translations of key works by Proudhon, Bakunin, and Tolstoy. For most of those years, he subsidized these consistently money-losing publishing operations out of his own pocket, using the money he earned at his day job as a journalist. After his parents had both died, by then he was in his early 50s, he inherited enough money to, in effect, retire and devote his full time to what had been for many years his hobby. He wasn't rich, but he could now afford to live at least as well as he had grown accustomed to living, while devoting his full time to the money-losing, non-profit libertarian work he wanted to do, and he didn't have to work for money in order to make all this possible. With some of his inheritance, Tucker founded Benjamin R. Tucker's Unique Bookshop at 502 6th Avenue in Manhattan, a shop that, during the short time it was open, attracted a varied clientele, including anarchist Emma Goldman and playwright Eugene O'Neill. The next time you watch Warren Beatty's Reds, imagine Maureen Stapleton and Jack Nicholson strolling back over to Jack Reed's Greenwich Village apartment from Benjamin R. Tucker's Unique Bookshop. A few blocks away from the shop, in a building on 4th Avenue, Tucker stored his overstock, including all his copies of the dozens of books he had published, and the typesetting and printing equipment he used to publish those books, to say nothing of his fortnightly paper Liberty and the Unique Bookshop's mail-order catalogs. When the building on 4th Avenue went up in flames in January of 1908, Tucker lost everything. He had been uninsured. He decided, after giving the matter due thought, that he could live more comfortably on his inheritance in France than in the United States, since the cost of living was much lower in France. So he, along with Pearl Johnson, his girlfriend, we would call her today, or perhaps his common-law wife, and their daughter Oriole, retired to Europe. After a bit less than a decade in France, they relocated to Monaco, where Tucker spent the last 20 years of his life. When Tucker moved to Europe, he announced plans to resume publishing Liberty in his new country, along with such books and pamphlets as my remaining means may enable me to print. But from the time of his arrival in France to the time of his death 30 years later, he never published another thing. And this was too bad, because the ideas he had published in Liberty were well worth spreading and popularizing. All the affairs of men, Tucker wrote, should be managed by individuals or voluntary associations, and the state should be abolished. Legal marriage and legal divorce, he wrote, were equal absurdities. As far as Tucker was concerned, all men and women had the right to love each other for as long or as short a time as they can, will, or may. According to William Gary Klein, writing in his book The Individualist Anarchists, Tucker rejected compulsory education, arguing that schooling should be paid for as a commodity by those who patronize such facilities. Protection from invasion, likewise, Tucker taught, should be based upon voluntary association or paid for like any commodity. Tucker wrote that anarchism favors peace, and according to William O. Reichert, he opposed war because it destroys liberty. According to Reichert, Tucker could not even condone wars that might be fought in the name of liberty, for war always, in Tucker's words, breeds the spirit of authority, with after-effects unforeseen and incalculable. Yet, when World War I got underway, Tucker spoke out, not for peace, not against war, but for the Allied cause in the conflict. In a December 1914 letter to the Detroit anarchist Joseph Labadie, he wrote that, "I favor the Allies because I pity the Belgian people, because I admire the British influences that make for liberty, because I feel some, though I regret to say a declining concern for the future of the American people, because I have a considerable sympathy for the people of Russia, and because I hate and fear the German people as a nation of domineering brutes bent on turning the whole world into a police-ridden paradise on the Prussian pattern. I have numerous other reasons for favoring the Allies, but the above is the main reason, and a sufficient one." A few months earlier, in a letter sent to several of his friends, Tucker had written that Germany's onslaught on civilization in August 1914 confronted all liberty lovers with a horrible alternative: either to offer no resistance and thereby suffer at Germany's hand a well-nigh total and probably permanent annihilation of our liberties, or to resist and, to make the resistance effective, suffer at our own hands a partial and possibly only temporary annihilation or suspension of those liberties. I take it that any earnest man who could hesitate in his choice must be blinded or dazzled by idealism, as to be incapable of interpreting the march of events with even the smallest degree of realism. For me, at any rate, there was but one road, and I took it promptly. From the start I have favored war to the limit, war till Germany, rulers and people alike, shall be so whipped and stripped that never more shall she have the will or the power to renew aggression. In choosing this course I deliberately accept, though with soreness of heart, the evils involved in it, to none of which I am more blind than any other pacifist. Among those evils I accept conscription, though conscription, which must commend itself to every believer in the state, equally with taxation so far as principle is concerned, is entirely counter to my political philosophy. I accept also the incidental evil of having to cooperate for a limited time with a considerable number of brutes. This capitulation to the forces of evil, the dogs of war, this abandonment of his own principles, was, of course, shameful. But it's not as though Tucker was the only important figure in the libertarian tradition ever to take such an action. Ludwig von Mises himself, who counseled his students to not give in to evil but proceed ever more boldly against it, said very similar things about World War II. Tucker, like Mises, is one of the greatest figures in the libertarian tradition, despite his weakness in the face of what seemed to him utter despair. Not only was Tucker the most eloquent of all 19th-century libertarians, he was also the most clear-headed about what sorts of institutional infrastructure would be necessary to encourage the growth of a political movement for free markets and individual liberty. It is impossible to read through the back issues of Liberty without noticing how similar it is to the Internet message boards and email discussion groups of our own time. And once the unique bookshop was open, there was a place for at least those libertarians who were nearby to gather and exchange ideas and strategies in person. The late Samuel Edward Konkin III used to describe what Benjamin R. Tucker devoted his life to building as the first libertarian movement, and I think he was right to do so. This is Jeff Riggenbach.